Hi everyone, welcome to Shenanigans with Shreya. Today's episode is going to be about music and its effect on the brain. These are essentially the two main components of my personality, I feel like. And I thought it would be really cool to look up and read about how music essentially changes lives out here. I did look up a few neuro studies on this and they're quite informative. So it's going to be a fun episode. What's really on brand for today's episode is that I went to a musical players society event recently for my university, and it just kind of made me realize again, like, I just love music so much. I'm always actively, writing lyrics down and working on random projects, which I probably should release at some point. I could try so many different things, but for me, I feel like I always find myself back to music. I had this discussion recently with someone about how universal the language of music is, and how even if we don't know the words to something, a lot of the times the beats are enough to evoke a response, whether it's, bopping along to it or feeling melancholic. There's just so much research going in, specifically in musical therapy for conditions like autism and Parkinson's. I also thought it would be really fun to figure out, why do different people have different music tastes? Like, what influences our likes and dislikes in music? And if you do play a musical instrument, how does that impact your cognitive learning? As someone who's been playing since I was 8 or 9, I found the prep for this podcast episode really, really fun. So essentially, here is the wealth of research we have available. Let's talk about listening to music, right? So what happens is auditory stimulation, whether it's in a concert or listening to music when you're doing a household chore, walking to college, stuff like that, you are essentially giving yourself auditory stimulus, which means you have a sensory response here. What's really interesting is, and something that I didn't really know before, is that music actually activates your autonomic nervous system. So essentially, what the autonomic nervous system is that it controls a lot of involuntary actions like breathing and your heart beating, vasodilation, vasoconstriction, things that you don't voluntarily think about, which is really cool because that essentially means that music has a subconscious impact on us, even if you don't realize it. There is this emotional response that music evokes, which is just so cool. Most of the brain lights up when we listen to music, including things like the hippocampus and the limbic system, which again, responsible for your memory, your responses in terms of movement. So the motor centers in our brain also respond to music, which might make you want to bop sometimes when you're listening to something. And I came across this research paper that suggested that listening to Mozart's sonata for two pianos in D major can actually help people with epilepsy because it reduces how frequently their seizures are happening, which I thought was insane. And there's also active work being done at the minute to figure out what type of music exactly could stimulate a group of neurons that you want specifically in an area, and seeing if different types of music stimulate different part of the brain. So when you listen to music that's in a major scale, that's more effective at making you feel better and relieving any sort of stress that you might have. For context, major and minor scales are different types of scales in music, and minor scales always feel a bit off, purposely a bit more foreboding. So it makes so much sense that people would relieve stress or feel better from listening to major music. A lot of emotional and sad songs tend to be written in a minor scale because there's more tension in those kind of songs. For people who are indifferent to listening to music, they're said to have music anhedonia, which means they wouldn't usually derive any sort of emotional experience by listening to music. And then there's the other end of the scale, which is essentially musicophilia, where people have an unusually intense reaction or just overall emotional experience from listening to music. So there are two ends of that spectrum. The general population falls usually towards the center. For music anhedonia, it's approximately 5% of the general population, which is very low. It's, even from a general observation point of view, it's kind of difficult to come across someone who doesn't really listen to music. But I do remember when I was in secondary school, there was a guy who, I asked him this question, oh, what kind of music do you listen to? And he was like, I don't listen to music, which kind of caught me off guard because I was like, oh my God, I didn't know there was this other side to it. Moving on to music therapy. So like, I study neuroscience, and I feel like the intersection between music therapy and neuroscience is just so interesting because we're basically figuring out how music affects your brain, what kind of active plasticity changes can occur when you listen to music. For context, plasticity is when the signals in your brain, your neuron pathways, are strengthened over time. And if they're used again and again, they can also form new pathways. So it essentially just increases the network in your brain signal, which is really good for memory, for learning. It keeps your brain pretty healthy. So at the minute, there are active musical therapy treatments being used to promote things like listening to music or singing a song or even playing an instrument to help people who have disorders like stroke and Parkinson's. It is a very individualized and specialized treatment plan depending on what the patient requires. But there has been research saying that listening to music or just engaging in any way in terms of having a musical experience really does help you have neuroplasticity, positively improves the quality of life that you're having. And I'd say the great thing about music therapy is that it's a non invasive technique. So there's no discomfort in having to have an invasive procedure done. Music does trigger the release of hormones like oxytocin and endorphins, and hormones can help deal with pain. And it also allows people who may feel socially isolated to connect with other people. We essentially love to listen to the type of music that the people around us are listening to. There is influence from our outer circle, which I will come into later on. There was a really nice paper that I came across where they specifically outlined one of the tasks that they do when they're dealing with autistic patients and how music therapy can help. So, an example of this would be using a popular song or a familiar song that the patient knows, and then they can sing along, which will help the patient develop speech better and allows them to develop their fluency in a language, increase their vocabulary if they don't know. And a lot of the times they might play the song over and over again, so it becomes predictable, right? And then gradually, the music therapist, whoever is hosting the session essentially, they will purposely leave out a word or a phrase and they'll ask the person with autism to fill in the blank. You still have your like rhythm and your tempo to it, but the person now is anticipating that, okay, I need to fill in the blanks here. So it helps them recall the lyrics, recall the words, say them. So it's helping them with memory recall and with speech responses, which is really cool. It helps the individual improve their communication skills and also keep their cognition going by recalling. I came across this really cool website on music mind brain research in Goldsmiths, University of London. And they have such interesting research groups. For example, there's one on music performance and how they're combining neuroscientific performance data with computational modeling to understand cognitive and neuroscientific processes that underlie music performance anxiety. And I think it's really interesting to have that intersection. If anyone's interested in music, in neuroscience and psychology, I'd highly recommend just having a look. Really cool research being done in this area. It could be the psychology of music and seeing how music helps children, things like that. So, moving on to what is the relationship between what we like in terms of the music we listen to and our personality. So, there has been research done that they're trying to figure out, okay, is there a correlation here based on what I came across and scoured the internet for? This correlation is really minor. It's not significant. We also mentioned before how culturally you are influenced by the type of people around you because human beings, we feel more connected when we have something common to talk about, whether that's, a sports game or a music album. So when you're listening to familiar music that you can actually discuss with people, it gives you more motivation to listen to something and to have that synchronistic experience with your friends, which again, it kind of amplifies this whole idea of having this group connection. So there's a study done in Canada which found out that even your age can actually determine what kind of music you like, especially when you're a teenager. Because when you're a teenager, your brain's still developing. It's a very significant time in your life. The Canadian study found out that teenagers who preferred really heavy music demonstrated low self-esteem and higher levels of discomfort. Teenagers who liked lighter music were very proper and they had a bit of difficulty balancing independence and dependence. And then teenagers who had a very eclectic music preference and just listened to whatever, essentially, they were more flexible and they used music according to how their mood is. So a lot of times, and I'd say this is an observation, even without research that can be made, that humans love to be perceived a certain way, and musical preference does influence how you will be perceived. And something that I found really cool was if you're listening to music with some sort of task or end goal objective that you want to achieve, your preference to that type of music will increase because that music is helping you be productive. So if there's a certain genre of music, which usually is lo-fi, chill beats, jazz music maybe, if that increases your productivity, you will naturally gravitate towards that genre or that type of music when you want to complete a task. And that makes sense because music engages with your brain in loads of different ways, which can make you more attentive and focused and increase your concentration. So there is a study from 2017 that essentially says that fast, soft music has positive effect on your productivity. Lyrics are distracting. I relate to that because I cannot listen to lyrics if I'm trying to study. It's better to have some sort of melodic underlying beat. There are different seasons where you have different preferences. So around December, even November, there are always going to be Christmas songs. You're going to hear them everywhere. It is the spirit. There was a study that in fall and winter, the participants of that study preferred to listen to more reflective and complex music. And the minute summer arrives, or spring even, the weather's getting warmer, participants prefer energetic and rhythmic music. Essentially, they love to dance. That study also concluded that pop music seems to have a universal appeal despite this season. Moving on to how playing an instrument may impact your brain health. There is evidence that playing an instrument keeps your brain healthy, specifically in old age, because it helps you recall information better, faster, build your networks, helps your cognition not deteriorate as much. And the article, which I'm probably going to list all articles down in the description, but this specific article mentioned that if you play the piano or the keyboard, they're probably one of the most beneficial instruments in trying to keep your brain healthy. Brass and woodwind instruments are good too. They did come to the conclusion that just listening to music on its own without actively playing it may not be affecting your cognitive health at all. So there is a preference to actually learn how to play a musical instrument when it comes to trying to keep your brain healthier as you grow older. Playing music, for example, it has benefits with patients who have dementia because, again, you're improving their memory recall, which is one of the main aspects of dementia. Something that's really cool with how music therapy helps patients with dementia is that they allow the patients to connect to the past. So, as you and I know, there are songs that sometimes evoke a nostalgic response within us. Call Me Maybe came out when I was in school, or Gangnam Style, and you just kind of remember your phases of life when these specific songs came out. And for patients with dementia, it really helps if there's a song that is prominent to them in some way. It might be, the song they had their first dance to, a song that they grew up with, which might help them recall memories easier and connect these little instances together to actually have them remember how their house looked like when they were younger, or who the people were around them, or what songs they used to sing with their children when they were younger. So that really helps overcome the difficult memory battle that comes with dementia. And again, these methods are used alongside actually showing them pictures or photos while playing the music to help them jog their memory, essentially, and to help them figure out their personal story. And again, there are two sides of this coin. So sometimes the patient might actually feel uncomfortable or not want to listen to a song because it triggers bad memories or bad emotions, which again, it's the job of whoever's the music therapist here to read the room and figure out what works best for the patient. And the reason why memory is so linked is because musical memory is essentially a form of implicit memory. And what that means is that it's really hardwired into the brain. Now, we're talking about the brains of musicians, essentially. When you learn a musical instrument, there is so much time and energy gone into it that it is kind of obvious that your brain will conform to some sort of structural changes, plasticity changes. There is a correlation between children learning music and them learning how to speak or forming their linguistic capacity. And the reason for that is that there are very similar neurophysiological mechanisms that dictate the processing of both music and language in children. So they're transferable skills, essentially. If you're learning music, you're more prone to being a bit more sponge-like when you're learning a new language. Something that I found really interesting, and that might not seem obvious, but after discussing how music impacts your plasticity and your memory and learning, it does make sense that listening to music can actually increase your intelligence. Music and memory, so very similar neural mechanisms, right? Learning to play an instrument, even as a child, will protect your brain from memory disorders like Alzheimer's, especially if you're a musician who reads music, because when you're playing an instrument and you're learning this whole musical language, you're learning how to read music, you're learning how to play, it strengthens the connections with your auditory cortex, which is essentially where your auditory stimuli, your sounds are going through. That's why there's this really good good recall component for musicians, because when you're learning a language as well, a foreign language, you can have a better verbal memory and recall mechanism. But then there is a flip side to this where, especially when you're young, when you do music and you have to perform, that might cause high anxiety within the performer. So usually young performers, if they haven't really dealt with how to manage their nerves or anxiety, that can lead to an accumulation of stress, and they're dealing with high levels of cortisol. They do feel this pressure and they might develop anxiety to quite a certain degree if it's not really worked on earlier or even noticed earlier. Something that I genuinely did not know was that listening to music can literally stimulate your immune system. So there is evidence that shows that musicians are more resistant to falling sick, like having a cold or, a virus, because playing an instrument can increase the production of immunoglobulin A, which is one of the antibodies in the immune system. So whether you play a musical instrument or you sing, even if you just sing in the shower, you're producing immunoglobulin A, which is basically your body's defense system. It's involved in the production of mucus in your membranes, which again, great for keeping pathogens outside the body. Now, most studies that are done on musicians specifically are usually done on children, but that's not to say that whatever age you are, you cannot learn an instrument. Our brains are still very malleable when we're younger, but that should not deter people from trying out new things when they cross, let's say, 18 or 19. You can always pick up a musical instrument. It might take a bit longer than it would when you were like 8, but that's fine. You can still get the same benefits from learning an instrument in your midlife, even later on. As you improve, which is the case in anything really, you will feel happier, you will feel better and more confident, and that will improve your focus and memory ultimately because you're honing in your skill set, trying to improve your musical ability, which essentially means you're trying to improve how much you learn and your memory. So yeah, that was today's episode on music and its impact on our brain. I thought this was a really fun topic to dive into, things I didn't know about music essentially. Do follow along if you're new here. This is also just PSA if anyone's interested. A few of my friends have reached out that they like to be part of the podcast, be a guest, which would be so fun. So if you're interested, send me a text if you have my Instagram, or comment on the podcast episode and we'll make it happen. I feel like talking to people is just so fun, and I'm looking forward to the upcoming podcast season. So yeah, thanks so much for listening, guys. I hope you learned a thing or two about music and its influence, and I hope you listen to some tunes after this to remind yourself of how awesome music is. Anyways, see you in the next one. Bye.